Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome along to Data Platform Down Under. This month, we've got Melody Zacharias joining us to talk to us on choosing the Azure migration path. Now, before we do hand over to Melody, just want to let everybody know that this session is being recorded and will be made available on our Data Platform Down Under YouTube channel. If you haven't already joined up, sign up to the YouTube channel and you can go back and have a look at the 18 or 19 sessions that we've already got up on that YouTube channel. For those of you who don't know, you've still got time, but SQL Bits is on next week. It is a hybrid event, and it is a fantastic event that you can choose or learn to go along either pre-cons or regular sessions and learn from some of the industry's best presenters. Okay. The registration URL is available. Feel free to register, go along next week, and it'll be a fantastic session for you. So with that, we'll hand over to Melody and get today's session running.
Excellent, thank you very much. I'm just gonna share my screen then. Turn my camera off here so that I've got a little bit better bandwidth. Sorry, I'm a little bit new to Teams. I am far more comfortable in Zoom, which is what I use for work. So forgive me. Are you able to see that blazing orange color that will wake up this afternoon, I hope?
Janice's favorite color.
Not anymore. He left us.
I know.
So sad. But so yeah, we're going to talk today about choosing your Azure migration path because it's one of my favorite topics. And Warwick said he would graciously allow me to talk to your group, so I appreciate that. Thank you for having me today. So just a little bit about who I am. I apologize for all the orange, but I am a pure storage Puritan. We call ourselves Puritans because we bleed orange. Pretty much all of us are absolutely enamored with our company because it's an amazing place to work. We basically all love working for Pure Storage. I don't know anybody who doesn't love the experience, and even people who leave still rave about how great the company is. But you can find me at those links, both for LinkedIn and Twitter. I'm somewhat active on both. I've been a Microsoft MVP since 2016 and recently awarded Regional Director for Microsoft as well. And basically all that means is I really love doing things like this, talking to people about technology, helping people learn new things, helping companies integrate their technologies, and helping make people's lives easier with technology in general, and helping people move forward with their technologies. And that also means that I like to get the word out, particularly obviously on the Microsoft side. Whether that's in books or in one-on-one conversations, presentations, what have you. So I guess not recently, but back in 2019, I helped a couple of other people along with myself publish Microsoft SQL Server 2019 administration by Microsoft Press. And I'm just starting now, if you haven't heard, that Microsoft is in private preview with SQL Server version 2022. So that's going to be coming out sometime this year. It's quite funny, every time somebody asks a program manager at Microsoft, when is SQL Server 2022 coming out? And they said, well, judging by the number in the name, if it doesn't come out sometime in that calendar year, I might be losing my job, or something along those lines, and that makes me laugh all the time. So I guess you can take it from the name that it's going to come out sometime this year, or as one of my coworkers said the other day, probably in one of the first 4 quarters of this year. So you can take that for what it's worth. I've been a community engagement person for quite some time, basically going back to about 2011 when I specialized in SQL Server. So basically, the only thing that I haven't done with SQL Server is get the tattoo. And so one of my buddies, Ed, he has a SQL Server tattoo, and I think I will be forever jealous because I don't have a SQL Server tattoo, but I'm not really a tattoo person. But I think that's very, very cool. So enough about me. Let's move on to the agenda. So why, as data professionals, is it important for us to know, understand the differences and the options for Azure migrations? And why do we really care? I mean, there are lots of options out there, and they can be complex and really often kind of confusing. When I first started looking into this, I actually found them quite confusing. And that's usually how I end up with these topics that I give. And the presentations that I end up giving is when I start learning or looking into something or having to do something for a client, and I find something just a little bit confusing or difficult to understand for myself. I think there's got to be other people out there who are finding this the same way or finding it confusing, and that, you know, the Microsoft documentation is just not quite as clear as I would like it. So I thought, so then the other thing is, many of these things, they interconnect, and sometimes the best solution is not just one of them, but sometimes a combination of them. So when should you use them? And which and where do you find them? And where do you find that information when you need it? So let's take a look at the migration to see what the migration might look like, so that you're familiar with it when you actually get down to doing your own. Before I move on, I also want to mention that I am Canadian, so I have this funny accent. If I'm talking too quickly, because sometimes this stuff gets me kind of excited, and I might talk too quickly. And with my funny accent, if you don't understand anything, I can't see the chat. So Warwick knows me well enough, and we're good friends, that he can tell me to either shut up, slow down, or something. And it really kind of doesn't matter what he says to me. I won't be offended because we're really good friends. So he can say it in whatever way, I won't be offended. So you don't have to worry about saying something that you think might offend me. You can just tell him and he'll say it to me. So you're okay with that, hey, Warwick?
Sweet as Melody.
Exactly, see? He can pretty much say anything to me and I won't be offended. So it's awesome. So it's important for you to know why you're looking at this, why you're interested in this, why should you even care? So I always, well, not always, I sometimes look to these analysts, and Gartner is one of the premier analysts in the world. And they forecast a rapid global expansion of cloud adoption, with end user spending on cloud services projected to grow over 20% in 2022 alone. So along with predictions that cloud spending will exceed 45% of all enterprise IT spending by 2026, that's quite a bit. Companies have traditionally had really two options for cloud migrations: easily accessible public clouds or customizable private cloud solutions. Today, hybrid cloud environments are expanding the possibilities. We can combine private cloud with public cloud, or public cloud with an adjacent data center such as Equinix. That's getting more and more popular just because of the really low lag time with these adjacent Equinix data centers. They're really particularly used in the high performance computing space, making that very, very usable. So for example, data available to customers can be stored on a public cloud server, while sensitive data is kept secure on private servers. So a lot of these options are growing. Many organizations favor a hybrid approach, basically thanks to its flexibility, its security, and some of its cost effectiveness. So according to the annual State of the Cloud report, which is a fairly common referenced report, 69% of businesses use a hybrid cloud solution. I'm sure that's not surprising to any of you. We see this all the time, whether you're a consultant or if you're just sort of cognizant of what's going on in our industry. But more than 90% of enterprises worldwide are relying on hybrid cloud and expect to by the end of 2022. And these multi-cloud and developments are in high demand. Industry surveys are finding that 97% of IT leaders plan to distribute workloads across 2 or more clouds. So these multi-cloud deployments are getting larger and larger all the time. So the likelihood that within the next year, maybe 2, 3 to 4 at the most, the likelihood that you're going to have to do a movement of this kind of data is very, very likely. And the likelihood that you're going to have to do it more than once is actually really quite high. So that's the reason I think this is important for all of us to learn, or at least be aware of what some of the options are, even if it's not part of your direct job or your purview today, to know some of the language, some of the jargon, some of the things that are even possible, or even at the very outside, even if you were an analyst, just to know the direction that Microsoft is taking so you can be aware of what's available or what some of the possibilities are in the future. So what are some of those options? There's multiple ways to move data to Azure, and ultimately you want to know what is easiest and best for your organization. But how do we determine that? Really, we need to break it down into how we're going to do that. At the highest level, there's VM migrations and database migrations. So first, you need to determine of those which fits your situation best. Although this presentation basically focuses on the data migration, I want you to be aware of all the options so that you're not just limiting yourself to one way or the other just due to simple lack of knowledge. So we're not going to dive into VMs too much, but I want you to be aware of them, to know what some of them are, and understand the options with them. So movements for VM, I've put this all into a table because there's a lot of information here, and you're going to find within this presentation a lot of diagrams like this. So I'll let you know right now that this, like Warwick said at the beginning, he's recording this presentation, but I'll also send Warwick by email a copy of all of my slides. Because what I've done within this presentation is, in the slides, basically given you a blueprint almost of a bunch of things to think about when you need to go into a project where you have to move data. And it'll take you through some of that thought process that you need to do if you're about to start a project. And you can look at this in a way where all the pieces are in one spot without having to search all over the internet to try and find things. So for example, this actually can be found in a Microsoft doc. Actually, sorry, not in a Microsoft doc. This is actually on GitHub. And at the very end of my presentation, I have a list of resources, and I've got links to where a lot of this can be found, but some of it's in the docs, some of it's in GitHub, some of it's just random websites where I've come across various pieces of information that are really quite helpful in determining the best way to do things, whether it's diagrams or tables like this of information that help you sort through the best way to move data for the best reasons and to determine, based on your situation, what is the best thing to do. So we're not going to necessarily, solve your problem today of whatever it happens to be, of the type of data movement you want to do, but I'm going to give you that sort of high level general overview of all of the different ways, or a lot of the different ways that you can move data, give you bits and pieces of the different ones that are important so that you understand the differences of them, and then you can decide at the time that you need to move data which one is best for you. And then in the demo, we'll go through an actual data movement with one of the newest tools that Microsoft has come out with just recently. So this one in particular for VMs basically goes through the VM movement. And I have to admit, I'm old enough that this actually made me laugh out loud when I was looking at it, because if you'll notice, if you're as old as I am, and you happen to notice this one down at the bottom of ship hard drive, I actually had to laugh out loud when I saw that. I was like, we actually ship hard drives still? Like, how big of a data set do you have to actually physically ship a hard drive these days with compression and all the things that we do? I remember back years and years and years ago when Azure first opened up their first data centers and people were talking about shipping hard drives. It did make me laugh. Years and years ago at a bank that I was working at, our idea of a DR site was literally what we called SneakerNet, because we had a backup that we did, and every time we did an update of the software and we had to do a database update, we took a backup, we moved it to the other to the DR site by literally driving it 4 hours through the mountains. And that was our DR backup. So I don't know what would have happened if something something happened and there was a landslide or something, but it always does make me laugh, some of the things that we did in the past. But yes, there is always that ship hard drive option, apparently still around. But when the important thing to remember here is to start at the top. That this wizard is still ultimately the best method for all of these migration options. It is the fastest, the simplest, and use it whenever possible. For new or existing SQL Server instances in an Azure virtual machine, whenever possible. I'm not going to go through each one of these individually. You can look up the details if you need to move an entire Azure VM, because there's lots of individual details about each one of these. You can see some of the highlights. When it comes to SQL Server, I listed some of the specifics here about where you might run into issues, because I expected this audience to be a very SQL Server heavy audience. But there are things that are specific to SQL Server. So for this one that I had underlined here, the SQL Server, it has to be SQL Server 2012, but then there's also, little things here like SQL Server 2016 and the 12.8 terabytes, little things like that. But look up the details if any of these are methods that you think that you will use to move an entire VM. So that means you're moving not only the server but the database together as one. And everything else we're going to talk about after this is just moving the data itself, not the VM. So all of these on this page here on, I believe it's page 6 of the slides is VMs and database all as one entity, and then everything else after this is going to be just data. So this is where I found, when I was looking at these, some of them got a little bit more confusing. So, and I think the reason for that is because Microsoft is terrible at naming. So the database experimentation assistant is an experimentation solution for SQL Server upgrades. It gives feedback on potential issues within an upgrade or for an upgrade. The data migration assistant is meant to help you upgrade to a more modern data platform by detecting compatibility issues that can impact database functionality in your new version, and of either on-premise SQL Server or Azure SQL databases. So it works either on-prem or with going from on-prem to Azure. The database migration service, which is the DMS, is a managed service used to do online and offline migrations. Then the SQL Server Migration Assistant, SSMA, of course, we didn't have enough acronyms yet, is a tool designed to automate database migrations to SQL Server from other databases. So databases such as Access, DB2, MySQL, Oracle, or SAP. Then, of course, there's the other category, which we'll talk about later. So things like PS tools, proprietary softwares, homegrown software, and the data access migration toolkit. So those are all additional pieces of tools that can all help you. And as I had mentioned, these all work individually, but they can also work collectively, which you'll see in this slide a little bit more in more detail. So you can see here where, let me see my pointer. So I'm trying to get my mouse to move where I want it to move. Okay, it doesn't want to move. Oh, here we go. So you can see here that the database migration assistant here is used in the migration service. So within the migration service, it actually calls the database migration assistant to do the analysis portion of the migration service. So when it's actually migrating, it still does the check for the analysis portion of the movement of data. I will get into each one of these individually to give you a little bit more detail about them and what they do, but just wanted to give you an idea of how there's this crossover piece of how sometimes they work together. So because of this, these two pieces are both used for migrations. The actual migration portion is used through all of these, and migration issues are also the same tool is similarly used for all three of these, because the actual migration function that is used was designed once. by Microsoft. But the translation that is used for each of these is a little bit different. Just how they do the mapping would be different for each of these. So for the database migration assistant, we'll get into that first. Or sorry, the database experimentation assistant. See how confusing they can be? I can't even say them properly sometimes. So this is actually one of my favorite. It's been around for quite a long time. The database experimentation assistant goes back quite a while. It's a tool that has been that is used for evaluating upgrades of SQL Server with specific workloads. The tool can be used for testing workloads coming from SQL servers as old as 2005, if you still have those. Really, the purpose of it is to give you confidence in a successful upgrade or a change that you've made. So this would be one of your first steps in analysis to determine any issues that you would have encountered in an upgrade scenario when you're doing an either an on-prem or an upgrade to Azure. This tool can be instrumental really in creating a baseline too for any kind of testing or upgrades or comparing of workloads that you want to do. These issues and comparisons can be found to you These issues and comparisons are found using a solution first introduced in SQL Server 2012 that was originally a command line tool called Distributed Replay. I used to give a presentation on that back when it was a command line tool, and I think that was my first presentation ever at Path Summit in 2015. And it didn't get a lot of use, I think, because it was a difficult to set up command line scenario, and it wasn't overly easy to use. But this new tool now has a GUI set up front end, and it's much easier to set up and run, and it can be run multiple times. And it's been expanded with the graphical interface to be simpler. The tool still collects data as it always has, in a manner similar to SQL Server Profiler if you're used to using that. And I think that's one of the reasons actually when they stopped promoting SQL Server Profiler. I can't remember what they call that when they say, I don't want to call it out of commission, but they no longer, I think they decommission something in SQL Server. There's a special name for it that I can't remember off the top of my head. Anyway,
are you thinking of deprecation, Melody?
Yes, thank you.
You're
so
welcome.
they deprecate, because they did deprecate Profiler, did they not?
Yes, so with Profiler, back in the release of SQL Server 2012, we got extended events, and no work was being done by the product team on Profiler since 2008 Part 2. And so any of the new features or functionalities in the new versions, you weren't able to get those. And what they did, because people weren't taking up extended events, the new Profiler that you see inside of Management Studio is actually extended events under the covers, but made to look and feel like Profiler, because that's what we all love to use.
Okay. I think this Profiler is the original Profiler that they actually didn't remove from SQL Server, if I'm not mistaken. But I could be wrong on that. They could have switched this over to extended events. I'm not positive. I should look into that actually. See, again, them with their names, it drives me bonkers, because now this would be extended events, not Profiler, but they're calling it Profiler, so it's very confusing. Anyway, I am not here to bash them about their naming. However, You can run a workload on a machine and collect the workload and then replay that workload on other versions, configurations, or setups of SQL Server. And that's really what it's meant to do. Once you have that source and run it through the analysis, you can run the analysis and the tool provides you a report showing you the performance implications based on, say, a threshold that you set. For example, if you deem maybe a 7% improvement to be a notable amount, and you set that threshold of 7%, then it'll be reported on the output to reflect any improvements better than 7% or any degradations as worse. So these are shown in like a pie chart that you can look at, and you can drill into each section to get further details. It'll give you summary statistics for individual queries shown on graphs, and it'll display, for example, how many queries degraded, errored, or improved, stayed the same, or really didn't have enough information to make a determination. And the nice thing I like about this is the tool can be run multiple times. Usually with something like this, the hard part is setting it up. But once you've set it up and you work with it once or twice, you get quite comfortable with it. It's not overly difficult. And you can compare it multiple times to multiple different versions. So it's very great. It's very nice to use with, say, multiple different hardware changes. If you're upgrading your hardware to see how that is used. Or you can use this for index changes. If you have just something small that you want to change once you already have everything set up. I've used it before with developers where I just have this set up on a VM on its own, so that if developers have a major change that they want to make, they can just run. I have a set production workload that they can run it against to see, and I have a baseline that they have to work against, and that they run their code with this baseline workload, and we see how that compares to a baseline of what a normal good standard day would be. So that if they have something, a major change that they want to make, say for a month end, and that's not something that we can test easily or see how it runs. It's a great way just to test performance on something. It's easy to collect the data and it's easy to run comparison workloads. So it's a handy thing to have. And like I said, the hardest part is setting it up. Once you have it running, it's nice to keep it running and reuse it over and over. It's also very lightweight. It's also very nice, as you can see here, it's got these different clients. So another way I've used this, just to give you like sort of real world examples where it might be useful, is, again, I have quite a bit of banking experience, and we had merged two banks or two credit unions, and we were also merging all of their data together, and we had hardware that we weren't sure was going to be able to take on the load of all of that data. So before we actually got into the project of merging all of that, we wanted to see if the hardware we had was actually going to be able to withstand doubling the client workload. So we actually were able to just double the number of clients we ran against our hardware using the same workload, of course, but it just gave us an idea of how many clients. So we just doubled the number of clients and ran it against the workload to be able to see how much more space, how much bigger of a server we were going to need, at what point, and at what point we could bring on these new branches before we needed to upgrade that server. And it gave us a good planning tool anyway. So things like that were quite useful. So those are some things to consider. It's a planning tool and not necessarily directly related to moving data, but it's a very helpful tool nonetheless. Any questions yet? I feel like I've just been rambling on. No?
Another jet Melody.
Data migration assistant. This is used here for the PAS. Sorry, my mouse literally fell off my desk. Sorry. This is for the PAS target. It's used to find compatibility issues and other migration challenges when you're targeting a SQL server on a variety of platforms. The data migration assistant, basically it recommends performance improvements and allows you to move not only just the schema, but the data and contained objects from a source to a target server. So this would be a first step in your analysis to determine the types of issues you might encounter in an upgrade scenario or a migration to Azure SQL database. So when specifically when targeting a platform as a service database, the data migration assistant does for that specifically finds compatibilities with the Azure version, because sometimes those are different than the on-prem version. And it finds partially supported or unsupported features, because sometimes those are different. But the other nice thing it does is it'll also help you find benefits from new features, because as we know, things come to Azure first before they come to the on-prem version. And sometimes it will find benefits for you or recommendations on things that might help you solve issues that the on-prem version doesn't have yet. And it'll make recommendations on things that you might want to do that will help solve some problems or make things faster for you that the Azure version has that the on-prem version, whatever version you happen to be running, isn't using yet. So it's kind of nice to have that as well, particularly if you're not overly familiar with the version that you're moving to. When you're in a SQL Server or an Azure VM, it'll help you detect compatibility issues for upgrades, potential benefits for performance, particularly security and storage. And one of the other nice things when you're looking at an on-prem or VM, the recommendation features, if you're moving to a VM, is quite nice, where it'll allow you to collect performance data from your source. So it'll take a look at your SQL Server instance of your hosting database on-prem, and it will help you determine a Azure VM SKU to move to. That's really when I've talked to clients and they're looking at going to Azure, one of the first questions I get is, how do I determine what VM I need? Like how do I know how to size my VM? So this is one of the things that has been most popular, I've found, with people using this service, is this SKU determination. It's just in preview at the moment. It's only available for command line. So it's command line interface only at the moment, but it is very well liked for those who have been using it, because it allows them to at least feel confident that they're not overbuying as often as they might otherwise be doing, because there's nothing worse than underbuying your storage and then having issues. So people have a tendency to grossly overbuy, and then that means overspend. And that's one of the number one complaints people have. I have found in consulting about Azure is that any cloud really is that they have a tendency to overspend. So that has been a popular feature. For the data migration service, it's the actual oops. Sorry. The data migration service is the part that actually helps you move the actual data. So it's not recommended that you run the data migration service on the same machine that you run the SQL Server on, because you don't want to compete for resources. So the service ideally would not be run on the same server as you are running your SQL Server on, just for resource consumption. Depending on the size of your database and such, they can use a lot of CPU. The other issue is when this runs, it does not move agent jobs, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So it moves your database, your schema, your data, and your users, logins, server roles, but not the agent jobs themselves. So there are a couple of different options that we talk about later in the other category. Azure Data Migration Service is a managed service, and it's a known ability is for doing online migrations is really where it shines, but it's designed specifically for doing multiple database sources. And it's the service is a combination of data migration assistance, as I mentioned before, that generates assessments, and a migration service to perform the actual steps needed to do the migration of the data to the cloud. So it is a service with a pricing tier. However, even the premium tier that allows for both online and offline migrations is free for 183 days. After the creation of the service, it's a great tool for one-time migrations and just to get you started. So I think the reasoning for that is they don't want you just having this service and running it all of the time, because there is, particularly for the online service, there is a way to just constantly move your data up to Azure with an integration runtime. So they don't want you to just be using the migration service to just be moving your data to Azure all the time for free. So I think that's the reason for the 183 days. Kind of makes sense. They don't want you just moving data there for free for no reason all the time. So I'm assuming that's the reason. But with the offline migration, the downtime begins at the time of the migration. And to limit your downtime, it's recommended that you basically use the online migration option to keep things in sync for the time between the migration completion and the actual cutover. So while you do the migration and getting ready to actually cut over to using Azure, while you're waiting for that process to happen, you use that integration runtime. So the quote unquote online process, just to keep things running. And then you take it offline just for the actual cutover to switch all of your connections over. The online option allows for the downtime to be limited to just the time the cutover happens at the end of the migration. So one of the newest options, which is the Azure SQL Migration Solution, is something that I'll demo for you today. Is a process that puts a front end to a lot of this, and it's a way for you to walk through a GUI and do this fairly simply. So you can see here the server instance in here, as long as you have a server instance set up either on-prem or in a private cloud, you can use this service. However, this service it's a little bit more specific. So the Azure Data Migration service we talked about was for a lot of like older versions and different things like that. This one has gotten very specific, and it is specifically for editions of SQL Server 2016 and above. So now this is almost more like an application to streamline movement of newer databases into Azure. And it's really quite simply, it's really quite simple to use. It supports targets that are either going to a managed instance or a Azure virtual machine. And those are the only two options. And they have to come from an SMB network file or from a blob container. And it comes through the Azure Data Studio, which is a newer tool as well. So it's easy to download through the marketplace and use within Azure Data Studio. And the rest of these pieces actually happen with behind the scenes. So once you have your source, you have to set up the target itself, and you have to have the most current backup. Then once you walk through the process, all of the application does this for you in the background. So all of these pieces happen for you in the background, and it will create it. With the online migration mode, the data migration service continually uploads the source backup files to Azure storage and restores them to the target until you complete the final step of cutting over to the target. In offline migration mode, data migration service uploads the source backup files to Azure storage and restores them to the target without requiring you to perform a cutover. And that's what I'm going to demo for you today. But what I wanted to show you just very quickly is the process that I just wanted to show you that I had created already the VM for the migration and all the networking, the disks and everything behind that, so that you understood that I created a net new VM behind the scenes. I didn't want that process itself takes quite a bit of time. So I had done that on the weekend before this session so that you didn't have to wait for that, because in the short period of time that we had for this session, we wouldn't have had enough time to go through that. So let's take a look at that. The backup I'm using in this demo is one taken outside the tool, and it's done with a checksum and a DB/CC check DB before migrating, just to make sure that the best practices are done and to make sure it's a good copy. I compressed it to make sure that it wasn't too large so that it wasn't going to take too long. Something to note with this is if you're using TDE encryption, you need to migrate the certificate manually. But if you're using always-on encryption, the data migration service will actually take care of that for you. So you don't have to worry about actually migrating anything. So those are some things to keep in mind. So let's take a look here. So I'm going to pop out of this, I think if I can, in slideshow. All right, and this takes us into Azure SQL, Azure Data Studio. So this is my Azure. Is everybody able to see that? Okay. How am I for time? Work?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. Azure Migration Server here. And I just wanted to show you that these are the databases. I'll quickly refresh this just so you can see that there is no database here. I have previously downloaded this Azure Migrate. So it's here. If you are looking for it, you can just, if you go to manage. Oh, that's terrible. Changed all my sizes and everything. When you go to, basically when you go to manage, it'll just come up, and once you've loaded it, and you can choose Azure Migration, and then it'll show up here. Let me make that a bit smaller. Just so you can see the whole screen. So once you have selected your migrate to Azure SQL, just move this out of the way. This is in preview, by the way. So if we're having issues, I blame it on that.
Melody, with it being in preview, is it only really working in the insiders, or have they released it for the GA?
That's a good question. I think it's GA, because I don't think this is an insider's build.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. I don't know why it wasn't acknowledging it before. So we select our database. It will assess it. It takes a look at it, and as I had mentioned, you have only the choice of a managed instance or an Azure virtual machine. In both cases, these have to exist. If you're doing any testing, I do not recommend a managed instance. They're ridiculously expensive. So I always use an Azure virtual machine, which I can make very small, very cheap, and turn it off when I'm not using it. This is the Azure recommendations. It has to be done by command line, and at the moment, I don't find it works all that great, but it is quite useful when you can get it to work. Getting it to check the database always is a good idea. It will take a look to make sure if there's any issues. This is a very, obviously, 2019 version of AdventureWorks. It's not going to have any issues, but I have done demos of the Data Migration Assistant, and I've run through versions of 2012 databases and things like that, and it will come back with issues. I've faked issues, created issues and problems and things like that, and it will find them. But it's always good to run this through multiple times, and when you're doing your testing, it's a good idea to run it through. So the Data Migration Assistant is also a separate unit, so you don't have to run it through this. You can download it as a separate module just to run on your server outside of this Azure SQL migration tool. And you can run it against your database at any time just to see what kind of disparity you have on your or in your database. So once you've selected that, you can just, assuming you have no errors, I don't believe it'll let you move forward with errors, but I wouldn't recommend you do if you did anyway. You have to have, obviously, an Azure account. You have to have an Azure tenant. You have to have a subscription. It always puts me in Australia, I think, because you guys are A, and then I have to go back to Canada. You have to have a resource group, and then you have to have a virtual machine set up before you can move forward. I do an offline migration because I want it to actually complete within the time of my presentation. Otherwise, it'll just wait for the next backup, and it will continue. I used a Azure storage blob container because I didn't have a network share to put it on. And once I picked my resource group, it conveniently found everything, but I had multiple backups, and so it didn't find the latest backup. If you choose the wrong backup or don't have the wrong backup, it will tell you and it won't work, it'll fail. So often, as long as you have one item, it often finds the next. So this actually happens to be the correct migration service. If you don't have one and you need to create one, you can. It's just a matter of having a resource group for it and creating it. If you need to create one the first time, but because I've run this demo a couple of times, so I wasn't testing on you guys and just making sure it works, I already have one. So, and then it goes through here and it tells you how things are set up. Then I only have the one database to run because I don't want this to take a long time. But the nice thing about this is if you have a server that has multiple interconnected databases, you can move them all at once. It's really common to have those interconnected databases regardless of the business you're in. There's very few businesses that don't have interconnected databases, and it's really important often to move them all at once together at the same time. So it's nice to have a service like this that you can move all of those at the same time. And this is the first service that Microsoft has come out with where you can move all of those at the same time. So I quite like it for that reason. So then we get it started here, and you can see down here, it tells you that it's starting. In this bottom right-hand corner, it is not verbose. I will tell you that. It is unfortunate that it is not a little bit more verbose or gives you more information, but there's a little bit here. It's got this a little bit of information there. You can refresh this status section that will sometimes tell you that it's in progress, sometimes tell you that it's completed, sometimes not. I am actually moving it to this server, the Azure Migration server. So eventually, like, we notice that it's not there now, and eventually it will show up there. And that's kind of all that the only reason that you know that it worked. Eventually it'll say that this is in progress if I refresh this often enough. And then eventually it'll say it's finished. And then why these sometimes, then they just sometimes goes back to zero, I don't know. Like I said, when I was working on this on the weekend, it had this big red sign up here that said it was in preview, but that's gone. So I don't know if it changed as of this morning, but, or maybe there was a new code update that I was not aware of. So we'll see what happens. Anyway, I'm going to go back to the presentation. We'll come back to this because it can take a few minutes. So we'll go through a few more slides. All right, so SQL Server Migration Assistant. This is, as I had mentioned before, a very, very similar process to the SQL Server migration, or the database migration assistant, but for databases that are not SQL Server. So going from something other than SQL Server to SQL Server, we're now going from DB2, MySQL, Oracle, Sybase, and Access to SQL Server. Really, basically all the same processes and ideas, concepts, but just using a different database. Not my area of expertise, but I do know some professionals who have done this before. So if you are delving into this area and run into problems and you need some help, reach out to me, let me know, and I will help you find somebody who can help you with these specifically. This is not a tool specifically that I've used, but I'm sure I can find somebody to help you. I understand that they work just as well from people that I've spoken to, but I haven't delved into the details of these ones. But my understanding is they work just as nicely. Causes of failure, because I mean, really, what's a presentation without some cat pictures, right? I mean, and of course, nothing's ever perfect. Something has to fail somewhere. Nothing I mean, so far I've just been giving you the highlights and telling you all this, oh, this is awesome, this is awesome. Something's always got to go wrong. Nothing's ever perfect, right? So some issues with these migrations are hierarchical data types are not well supported. Hierarchical data types are supported, but they must be with version 2019 and above to be migrated, excluding any tables from these data types, or from these tables with these data types from the configuration or migration settings where you specify table for migration. So in the not in the demo that I showed you, but in the version that you download and would run on your in the data migration service, not the one that I had showed you, but the other one. They all have a similar name, but the other one. You can select what tables that you want to run. You don't have to necessarily migrate an entire database. So you would specify just leaving out that table. Alternately, if it's an option to migrate these data types offline, you can use code to determine if any of these tables have columns that have an unsupported data type, and then just do those tables separately. Temporal tables also are not supported for online migrations. You'll want to exclude those from the configuration as well. So exclude those tables. Migrate the settings where you specify the tables for migration again. So if you know which tables, and when you do the data migration assistant, it will tell you. So it's not like you have to go through and figure out what tables you happen to have, or actually have to know that you have hierarchical data types or temporal data types, unless you have those data types in a standard data type. So you have that data in a like in a text field or something like that. Like if you have it in a non-hierarchical data type field, then it could be a problem, because it won't notice it. When it does these checks, it actually looks at the data type field, not at the data type itself. So that's an important piece of information. It's really important to, when you do these types of migration, to really understand your data, because all of these automated tools look at things like data types. They don't actually look at the data itself. So you have to know your data, particularly when it comes to legacy data. That's where you can really run into trouble. Active triggers are not supported for online migrations. I think that would be kind of obvious, but something that we don't necessarily always think about. So really all triggers should be disabled before migrations. Kind of an obvious thing, but not something that we necessarily think of. Something that would quickly slip our minds. And large object data types will require special handling. In this context, a large value data type are anything really that exceeds a maximum row size of 8 kilobytes, or columns that are larger than 32 kilobytes might get truncated at the target. So exclude those tables from your configuration migration settings, and specify those tables. So specify those tables to be removed, just to make sure that you don't run into any trouble. And then when it comes to timestamps, keep in mind that Azure generates a new value for the target table. If you need the source value migrated for the timestamp, then get in touch with the engineering team. There is a workaround for this, but you have to work directly with the engineering team. It's not something that is standard. So they'll have to do some, like standard code, or a specialized code, I should say, workaround to have those timestamps converted. so that you get the original timestamps. I know in banking that would be a huge issue. I've done enough banking migrations to know that people would just lose their minds if I told them that. So keep that in mind. That could be hugely important depending on your industry. Other options. So I'm just going to quickly peek back here, take a look at our little migration, see how it did. Doesn't seem to be doing anything. It says it started. Huh. Wow, it's slow. When it actually gets going, it doesn't take long, so okay. We'll come back to it. Other options. Data DBA tools for agent jobs, code checker, various third-party tools, custom tools, and I wanted to note that Backpack is no longer supported by Microsoft for migrations to Azure. So I wanted to throw that out, let everybody know in case that was something that you have done in the past or were considering doing in the future, or if it's something that you are comfortable doing or consider doing. So I know it's something that people have done in the past, but it is not something that is supported by Microsoft going forward. So wanted to let you know about that. DBA tools is an example of an option for migrations. It's an open source, if you haven't heard about it, it's an open source PowerShell library that was created by Chrissy Lemaire. She's a SQL Server and PowerShell MVP, and a host of other people have been helping her to expand and improve on this library. There's a section that's based on a Microsoft post to migrate an on-premise SQL Server to a managed instance. So in the resources, I put a link to the blog that was written by Microsoft on how to do that. And the reason I did that is because it details how to create the PowerShell scripts that automate the migration to the managed instance using PowerShell and DBA tools, using an offline migration option. But most importantly, the Azure PowerShell controls and manages the Azure resources, and the DBA tools initiates the migration of the logins and the agent jobs. And the agent jobs is something that can be really, really valuable because it's one of the only ways that I know of to automate that at the moment. So this is a great way to get familiar with how to automate those agent jobs and get them migrated without having to manually recreate them. Because at the moment, this is the only way I know of how to do it. And it's kind of spelled out right there for you. If you have any sort of minimal comfortableness, I guess, with PowerShell, then I would highly recommend you take a look at it. And there is a huge following around DBA tools, and a lot of people who would be happy to help you out if you need any help with that. So fabulous group of people. 3 of which I know are on this call that would be happy to help you, and many more in the SQL community that would be sure to help you out as well. Then another one, which is part of the data access migration toolkit that we were just looking at. There's the preview. That's where I saw it. Oops. The data access migration toolkit that we were just looking at, and I was, yeah, that we were just looking at. Anyway, it's the latest version. If you are downloading it, to use on your desktop, the latest version introduces support for analyzing database connectivity and embedded SQL queries in application code. So this is quite nice. So for quite some time, we've had the ability to look at the databases themselves. This is the first time we've had the ability to actually look at code. So what this does is it's a Visual Studio Code extension, and the latest version of this extension adds .NET application and T-SQL dialect to allow the command to report SQL connectivity commands and queries. So it looks at the connectivities and all the queries, it reviews it and creates a report that can then be put through the data access migration tool to data access migration assistant, I think, our analysis assistant, to determine which where there are where it can be analyzed, so it can be analyzed and determine where there's parity issues. So just like where it goes through and determines in your database where there are issues that need to be improved for that migration, or that if you're going to be upgrading. So if you're upgrading from SQL Server 2012 to even 2016 or 2019, and there's parity issues, or whether it's issues with say a size of field, or something is deprecated or anything like that, it will now do that same thing for any SQL code that is within the application. So basically it strips it out. It has access to the application's data layer. It exports the report as a JSON file. Then it starts the data migration assistant and enables assessing the queries and identifies in the application within the context of modernizing the database to the Azure platform, to start the migration assistant and basically create and assess the project. And it'll give you an output telling you what needs to be updated or fixed or changed. So that would be hugely helpful. I can't tell you how many clients I've run into who have tried to upgrade, where it's actually a quite common scenario where clients have upgraded. It was really common when clients would go to 2016, because one of the things that Microsoft had touted was, you know, out of the box, 15% faster. And it was true. You know, the engine itself was 15% faster. They had made so many improvements in so many different things that it was simply 15% faster, even if you were on the same hardware. Well, I had a client that, or actually, I was brought into a client by somebody else who had actually sold them new hardware, brand new hardware, faster hardware. They put a new version of SQL Server 2016 on it. They put on their old code with this brand new SQL Server 2016, and it wasn't any faster. The problem was their code was so old that their code was slow, and it was slowing everything down. So SQL Server was faster, their hardware was faster, their code was terrible. So it was the code that was slowing everything down. And this was actually a hardware vendor who brought me in to say, what is wrong? Why do they have this problem? Because the customer didn't want to buy the hardware because they thought it was the hardware was the problem. And so they needed to somehow prove it, and nobody knew why. They couldn't figure it out because they thought with newer hardware it should be faster. Microsoft says SQL Server's faster. Nobody could figure out what the problem was. And it's not easy to find where in that code those issues are and to prove what the problems were. So it takes a very specialized SQL professional to be able to find those code problems. So this is a much quicker and easier way to do it. And it will save you a lot of time. And then third-party vendor solutions. So a lot of these things are things that that Pure Storage does, but it's not just Pure Storage. A lot of our competitors do the very same thing. So I'm not touting any one vendor. I'm just saying that vendors do this. Typically, it's software on top, in our case, on top of our hardware. But there's software solutions that will help you migrate data and do all sorts of things on top of that as well. So whether it's simplifying things or helping you move data, sometimes they have additional pieces that will help you along the way, whether that's compression or deduplication or provisioning, to make those moves easier as well, whatever that happens to be. And then a whole slew of resources to help you. This is the long slide of resources. But before we end this, I want to quickly pop back here and see if keep refreshing this migration to see if it's done. It's not. Maybe I can take some questions while we try to see what's going on with this, why it's not finished.
Okay, so Melody, we've got one question from Mike. He's asking specifically around the Azure Migration service, right, extension in Azure Data Studio. If the client is disrupted while you've started this, okay, so you're running it on your PC and you lose connectivity to your network, does the migration drop out? Is it required to have ADS running on your local machine for it to complete?
It doesn't have to have on my local machine to complete. It depends on where it's at. So once this is on my local machine to start the process. So once this goes to Azure, it will be there and it'll do its thing, and then it just sends back saying that it's completed. So all the actual work for this will get done on Azure. Particularly in this case for this demo, because the blob storage where the backup is also in Azure. So the database that is being moved was on-prem. The backup I pre-moved to a blob storage on Azure. So it's a matter of where in the process that connectivity gets lost. But in terms of Azure Data Studio, it's like your management studio. It doesn't matter where it is.
Okay. So you were saying with your backup, so as part of that, you're able to take a backup and pre-move that to, like you've said, you move that backup to a blob container to assist with the time it takes to go and do that. So does the migration look at the backup as part of that migration, or is it looking at connecting to your local instance, wherever that happens to be, whether that be on your local machine or in an on-premises data center, to do any form of the interrogation, or is it purely taking it from that backup that you're supplying?
To do the analysis?
Yes.
It looks at the local version to do the analysis.
Okay. Does anybody have? Oh, and Mike says, thanks, good to know.
You're welcome, Mike. You guys are so nice.
Does anybody else have any other questions for Melody?
I feel bad that this isn't going. I do have a recording of it in the slides. So when you get the slides, there is a recording of the demo in the slides themselves.
Nice.
So, because, you know, whenever you do a demo, there's always something's going to go wrong, right? It's like karma.
The demo gods are either with us or not.
Exactly. So, here, I'll show you this. So this slide is like the intro kind of slide, and then the slide that looks like this is actually a demo. So if you go down here and you press play, this is actually just what I had done for you guys. And if I move this along, maybe we can see what the end was supposed to look like. Is there no speeding this thing up? Oh, yeah, so you can see the migration completed. And then, because that's really all it does, is it just migration completed. And then I refresh it. And there's the database. So when eventually it finishes, that's basically all you'll see. You'll see that this migration completed and the database shows up on the new server.
At least we were able to get that to complete successfully.
Gotta love those recorded demos, just in case.
Yes. So Mike's just typing potentially another question for us. So if anybody else does have any questions, you've got a SQL issue to go and fix, so he needs to leave us for today. But thank you for coming along, Mike. And he says, thank you for the session, Melody.
My pleasure. Thanks for coming out, everybody.
So with that, if nobody else has any other questions, I would like to thank Melody for giving up her time and coming along and presenting as part of Data Platform Down Under. As mentioned, this session has been recorded. Melody is going to supply us with the slide deck, so you will be able to have a look at the recording from inside of the slide deck for the migration part. But for the whole session, that will be available up on our YouTube channel. So feel free, you're able to come back and view this session at any point in time to look at both Azure Data Studio, plus also the new extension for Azure Data Studio, as well as any of the other options that Melody has presented to assist you with your migration process. So thank you, everybody, for coming along. Thank you, Melody. I wish everybody a fantastic day. Stay, if you haven't already registered for next month's session, we have, bring it up, my internet running a bit slow, but that's all good. Next month, we have a CI/CD in database development brought to us by High Hastings. So look forward to seeing everybody in a month's time for our next session. In the meantime, stay safe, enjoy learning. If you've got the opportunity, register and go along to SQL Bits next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, bye.